Welcome. This service is provided by freeconferencecall.com.
Please announce yourself.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
So we can start. We're going to get started in a minute or two, so if people want to grab anything, coffee, fruit, this would be a good time to do it.
I just wanted this. It's the first time I've been up here. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. It's a nice place, isn't it? We are too. Thank you. So, good afternoon. I'm Nick Freudenberg. I teach public health here at the CUNY School of Public Health, and I'm also the director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. And we're very pleased to welcome you here today. I'd also like to welcome everybody on behalf of our dean, Ayman El-Mohandes, who unfortunately had to be out of the country this week, but sends his greetings and his congratulations to our speakers, who I'll introduce in a moment. Just a couple announcements before we get started. First, our next session is scheduled for November 17th. Which I think is a Thursday morning, and our topic will be immigrant access to food benefits. And we'll send a notice with the particulars to everybody in our mailing list, but we wanted you to put that on your calendar. And second, for any of you who are connected, who are faculty or staff at CUNY, any people here who are faculty or staff at CUNY? We're organizing an event to bring together CUNY faculty and staff who are working on food or food policy throughout the university. And if you've not yet gotten an invitation but would like one, send us an email or speak to Ashley, the photographer and general performer of all tasks for the Urban Food Policy Institute. And finally, we're very happy to announce that we have hired a new deputy director, and it's Craig Willingham. Craig, you want to stand up? Craig is starting next week and joins us from the New York City Department of Health, currently at the Center for Health Equity, and he's played an important role in two issues that are very close to the heart of our institute. One is looking at the food retail environment in New York City and looking for ways to encourage greater access to healthy, affordable food particularly in low-income communities in New York City. And Craig has worked in several city health department programs to increase access to healthy food, and we hope that he'll bring that knowledge to us here at the Institute, and also the connections to what has really been a essential partner to our Institute, which is the City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Craig has also worked on another issue very close to our heart, which is looking at how at equitable access to healthy food in New York City, and looking at how race and racism shapes access to food. And those are issues those of you who've been reading our things know we care very much about, and we're looking forward to gaining from Craig's experience and knowledge about those issues. So welcome, Craig, and happy to have you here, and we look forward to working together. So today's session we'll have two authors of a new book, Beyond the Kale, talk about their book. And the authors are Kristen Reynolds, who teaches food and food policy at the New School, at Yale, and at several other places. And Nevin Cohen, who is a faculty member here and the research director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. Now, a bunch of people have written over the years about urban agriculture and community gardens in New York City. And another set of people have written about the way that class and race influences food and how people get engaged in food and access to food in New York City. But what I think is the wonderful contribution of this new book is that those two themes come together. And Kristen and Nevin in their book look particularly at how issues of race, class, gender, equity play out in urban agriculture and community gardens in New York City. And so I'm really happy to have them here and welcome. They'll talk for half an hour or so and then answer questions from us.
Thanks so much, Nick, and welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. This is actually our first truly public discussion of this book, and so we're really excited that you're joining us. And Kristen and I will be speaking in turn. We'll talk about various themes in the book, and so we'll go back and forth, and I'll turn it over to Kristen to begin.
Great, and I'm going to go back to the beginning of our slideshow here. I don't know what happened, but oh, well, that was supposed to be the cover of our book. Let's see.
Okay.
Well, where did that go? We saw it already. Perhaps we'll see it again at the end. So the book is Beyond the Kale, Urban Agriculture and Social Justice Activism in New York City. I wanted to kind of give a bit of a background and about how this book came to be and how we became interested in writing such a book. So since we can't see that cover, we can see a different cover here. Nevin and I were both researchers on a project called Five Borough Farm that began in 2009-2010, which was a project of a nonprofit called the Design Trust for Public Space, an interdisciplinary research project to understand what was happening with respect to urban agriculture throughout New York's 5 boroughs, to devise policy recommendations to support and strengthen urban agriculture throughout the city, and to suggest metrics and evaluation tools that farmers and gardeners could use to measure and evaluate the outcomes of their programs in order to both improve what they're doing in gardens and farms, and also to speak with policymakers and funders about how they might be able to better support their work through policies and funding programs. Through our research, we were asking a lot of questions about the nature of what happens on farms and gardens in New York City, the ways things are laid out, how things are funded, and the different benefits that people running farms and gardens associated with their practices. We were also thinking about, again, developing metrics to help to articulate not only the quantitative outcomes of community gardens and farms in the city, but also qualitative outcomes, like long-term friendships that students are developing within gardens, like learning about public health and the ways that that might translate into long-term outcomes that can be more difficult to measure. We also asked questions about what farmers and gardeners were experiencing as challenges, but this was a general and a rather open-ended question that we asked. And we heard a lot of typical answers that we hear when we conduct research on urban agriculture. It's difficult to access and maintain land for farming and gardening in the city. It's hard to get sometimes tools and seeds and other materials to practice urban agriculture. It's hard to get funding to support a number of different activities at farms and gardens. So these were not surprising findings to us with respect to challenges, but we also heard that from a number of the people that we interviewed in this project, that there were race and class disparities within urban agriculture within New York City. And from the framework of having both of us done a fair amount of research prior to this on urban agriculture, it came as kind of a surprise to hear this, because urban agriculture is often spoken about as a way to advance not only food access, but by correlation, food justice. Not only educational access, but by correlation, educational justice. So in thinking that urban agriculture was a strategy for social justice, it kind of took us aback to hear people talking about race and class disparities. But as we thought more about this, we realized, as we should have probably much earlier, of course, urban agriculture is situated within broader social and political contexts.
Speak into the microphone.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Thanks for telling me. So we realized, of course, that urban agriculture is situated within broader social and political contexts. So within this context, learning that there are race and class disparities makes sense, unfortunately, but was less surprising. And so we thought that we would like to help make this finding within urban agriculture more apparent. However, within the context of the 5-Borough Farm Project, we hadn't really asked a lot of questions about race and class disparities, nor had we made any explicit effort to highlight the work of people of color and low-income people who have been for a long time leading urban agriculture projects in New York City and many cities throughout the United States for decades. So with this in mind, we decided that we would conduct further research, which eventually became the research for Beyond the Kale and this book. And we had basically 3 goals within the book, which are to help to shift the narrative of urban agriculture, to recognize that we have to address social and political structures that give rise to food access inequities, public health inequities, and other forms of social injustice. The second goal was to highlight the work of people of color and women in urban agriculture and the leadership roles that they have played for a long time and continue to play in the field. And the third was a bit of a different question, which is about how scholars and scholarship and academics and researchers, and we'll talk more about what we mean by those terms in a bit, can help contribute to the work of people who are using farms and gardens to address specific forms of social injustice in cities, and how we can use our tools as public policy experts, as I'm a geographer, as social scientists to help support this larger movement. So this was what really gave rise to the book. And a last thing I'll say about it is that we decided to specifically speak with people of color and women. So it was a selective sampling strategy that we used to identify our interviewees. We interviewed people from about 20 gardens and farms throughout the city. And this is a map that shows where our study sites were located. So it was really throughout New York.
Great. So I'll jump into some of the vignettes that we present in various chapters of the book. And unlike many academic publications, we really made an effort to and decided to give people voice. And so the farmers and gardeners that were interviewed are all named in the book, and their activities and issues are really presented in their own voices. And this first the first chapter is about Farmer Jan, Yonette Fleming of Hatty Caron Community Garden, who's pictured here. Farmer Jan, as she often refers to herself, runs food and justice workshops that discuss food accessibility in the neighborhood of her farm. She discusses processes of racism and patriarchy and discusses how these forces shape food and agricultural systems. She calls upon the participants in workshops that she holds at the farm to think about their own lives and what they might do to confront these issues of race and class disparities. She's a farmer, she's producing food, but in addition to that, Fleming also runs food justice training sessions. And she and other members of Hatty Caron Community Garden regularly lead events that extend the understanding of gardening beyond an activity focused on food. So summer weekends feature 2 on-site farmers markets, one of which is held at the Urban Farm, a second smaller site that Fleming and other community members have more recently transformed from a vacant lot into a vibrant green space. Seasonal events throughout the year celebrate the heritage of the African diaspora and feature dishes that Fleming, who comes from Guyana originally, and other community members have prepared using eggs and produce from the garden and farm. Fleming also leads women-only discussions about health and spiritual wellness, along with centric events designed to foster themes of these events: food access, urban green spaces, safe spaces for women. The gatherings also focus on community resilience, and particularly due to Fleming's leadership, ways that racial justice and women's empowerment can be cultivated through the urban agriculture system. And Fleming speaks regularly about how the various forms of oppression play out with respect to food and the environment, and explains, quote, "I'm interested in understanding how women can become true advocates for flora and fauna and justice in the world." And so this case shows that by growing food, by working to break down oppressive social systems and celebrating connections between and among people and the land, Fleming and the gardeners that work with her exemplify the potential power of longtime neighborhood residents to create change in their own communities that have far greater effect than just the food that they grow.
Our second chapter in the book starts with a vignette, as all the chapters do, about Taqwa Community Farm, which is in the South Bronx. So I'm going to read the vignette and I'll elaborate afterward. Near Yankee Stadium, Abu Talib tends a nearly half-acre oasis of vegetables, cherry trees, and chickens, with a play area for neighborhood children. In 1992, Talib, together with his son and other community residents, cleaned what was then a trash-strewn lot and turned it into Taqwa Community Farm. Vacant parcels like the one that became Taqwa were the consequence of public policies ranging from urban renewal and scaled-back city services that disrupted social networks, destroyed housing, and contributed to public health, environmental, and economic ills in the South Bronx and other low-income communities throughout New York City. Taqwa was created as the neighborhood was rebounding from decades of neglect, but despite the city's economic growth in the 1990s, problems of alcohol abuse, drug trafficking, and gang violence persisted in the streets surrounding the farm. Motivated by a desire to improve conditions in his community, Abu Talib organized a group of volunteers and met with officials from the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation to get permission to garden the site. He and the other neighborhood volunteers turned it into what has since become one of New York City's best-known community gardens and farms. And so today, Talib manages the garden with his fellow gardeners and community members. And it has regular open hours for non-gardeners, hosts educational events, is part of a network of urban agriculture training programs throughout the city. The point that we make in this chapter that begins with the Taqwa Community Farm is that though some urban agriculture activists are very, I would say, explicit and forthcoming about being activists, they are here to make social and political change, and that is first and foremost in the work that they do. And I guess I need to be closer again. So while this is true for some of the folks that we interviewed for the book, others, like Mr. Talib, do say, well, we're not so concerned about language and terminology. I don't necessarily associate with being an activist. From the standpoint of observing the magnitude of change in this block surrounding Taqwa Community Farm, we argue that this garden and farm, because of its situatedness in this particular community, because of the long-term history that the gardeners and the leaders of the farm and garden have in the community itself, that though they're not necessarily calling themselves activists. They are indeed activists in the sense that they're making change in the community based on where they're coming, based on their history and their deep integration into the neighborhood in which they're working.
The next chapter is about Brooklyn Rescue Mission and Bed-Stuy Farm, led by Robert and Devaney Jackson, co-founders and reverends who grow produce and raise chickens at their farm. The farm is a project of the mission's Urban Harvest Center, which they co-founded with other community members in 2002. The organization is a faith-based Christian ministry that provides food, clean clothing, and other support services to low-income and homeless individuals in the central Brooklyn neighborhood. The Reverends see service through feeding people as a central part of the Christian mission, and they act upon this belief through the numerous community activities that they lead. The mission began providing food to the community through an emergency food pantry, but in 2005, the organization expanded its programs to include a garden, a greenhouse, fruit trees, chickens, and an aquaponics system to raise fish. The organization also runs a CSA program and 2 farmers markets through which it distributes produce from its own farm and farms in upstate New York that sell there. The markets regularly feature healthy cooking demonstrations to help neighborhood residents, many of whom have diet-related health concerns, to integrate healthful foods into their meals. Local entrepreneurs sell value-added food products like jams and baked goods at the markets, which the Jacksons see as a way to promote economic development.
You're here.
Oh, sorry, please raise
We're
your hand.
talking about you.
Yes,
Devaney and
Reverend.
Robert Jackson.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Perfect timing.
And actually, we didn't show the farm either.
Brooklyn Rescue Mission also runs a youth internship and employment program, as well as a senior citizens program that provides food and various social activities for neighborhood participants. These are just a few of the ways that the Jacksons put their faith into practice. On the surface, Brooklyn Rescue Mission appears to be like many other urban agriculture groups in New York and elsewhere that grow food, manage on-site farmers markets, run educational programs, and offer an oasis from the built-up urban environment in hopes of improving city life. Yet the mission's food and agriculture programs are grounded not only in the Christian values of social justice, but also in a structural analysis of the persistent inequities affecting residents in this historically low-income neighborhood. And when speaking of the Jacksons, and it's a little embarrassing because you're here and I'm speaking of you, but when speaking of the Jacksons, it becomes clear that they see the disparities in the food system that affect African American and Black communities as a consequence of uneven economic power. Reverend Jackson's analysis is that food is based on economics and politics. He asks, quote, how are you going to have control over access to your food if you don't have economic power? Both Robert and Devaney Jackson speak about urban agriculture as the starting point for a self-reliance movement. And as it's been for many of New York City's urban agriculture activists, the Jacksons' analysis of power in the food system has been developed with an up-close awareness of structural racism and the ways that it plays out in people's everyday lives through the lack of economic opportunity and multi-generational poverty. So while the day-to-day activities at the Bed-Stuy farm look like those of other farms and gardens in the city, activists like the Jacksons use urban agriculture to cultivate a different socio-political and economic reality in which people of color have more control over the food systems in their own communities and in which low-income communities have more economic power.
I'll read again. So our next chapter in the book is begins with a vignette from the Friends of Brook Park. One summer evening, Friends of Brook Park, a grassroots environmental organization in the South Bronx, hosted a meeting of local community development corporation called Nos Quedamos. The gathering took place in Brook Park Community Garden, which Friends of Brook Park oversees, and was a strategic move on the part of the two organizations. Ray Figueroa, pictured here, who is the Friends of Brook Park's Director of Social Ecological Development Projects, explained to us that the idea was to bring the two groups together to build a broader network of activists working on related issues in the South Bronx community. Friends of Brook Park focuses on urban ecology and environmental justice, with the garden and a related youth farming project among its core initiatives. Nos Quedamos runs projects to increase financial literacy, clean up brownfields, and build affordable housing in the Melrose community of the South Bronx, which are also of concern to gardeners in the Brook Park Garden and Farm, and about a dozen other community gardens with which Nos Quedamos works. For Friends of Brook Park and Nos Quedamos, gardens are perfect spaces for coalition building, as they're both literally and figuratively common ground where community organizers from housing, environmental justice, and other social justice movements can build political strength in their neighborhoods, lacking the clout that wealthier communities often take for granted. In describing the organization, Ray Figueroa explained, "We share our struggles, and coming together is a way to share our strengths as well." Following the Brook Park Nos Quedamos meeting, the two organizations continued to work together in strategic partnerships with other groups in the city to advocate for policies to address fundamental social justice issues: poverty and unemployment, racial and gender discrimination, and environmental racism. Friends of Brook Park has also worked with networks that includes a homeless advocacy group and a housing rights organization to advocate for policies that recognize the inherent connections between housing and food as basic human rights in the city and elsewhere. Policy advocacy is clearly important to these groups since municipal, state, and national policies have an immediate effect on urban agriculture, affordable housing, and other social and environmental issues, and how these are considered in the future. In the case of Friends of Brook Park and other organizations that are situated in lower income communities in New York City, policy activism is also important because of the history of political disenfranchisement that has contributed to many of the social justice issues that the groups address through their work. Building on the tactics of the generations of community gardeners that came before them, they employ social movement and community organizing methods of coalition building, reframing issues so that they are politically salient, and forming strategic temporary partnerships to accomplish common policy objectives. In the book, we argue that these initiatives are examples of what have come to be known in policy literature as new political spaces. Those are places where policy is formulated outside of the formal halls of governance, outside of City Hall, outside of legislative offices, to distinguish a shift in these strategies and recognize the fact that activist groups and advocacy coalitions are actually part of policy making, rather than something that is somehow apart and only advisory. And the argument that we make then in this chapter is that the examples in the vignette and others that are in this chapter show how urban agriculture activists are actually enacting policymaking through this concept of new political spaces within the gardens, within their farm programs, and that their work is perhaps more politically powerful than we might otherwise think of if we didn't see their work as directly connected to policymaking, related to social justice, urban agriculture, and much wider issues throughout our city.
So our next case is La Finca Del Sur in the South Bronx. It's a 2.5-acre community farm and garden led by Latina and Black women and their allies. And it was founded in 2009 in collaboration with another local nonprofit called More Gardens. The farm is a part of La Finca's strategy to build healthy neighborhoods in an area of New York City that has experienced some of the most negative effects of government abandonment, disinvestment, and environmental racism. At the street level, the farm site appears to be a less than ideal place to build an outdoor community space. It's bordered by a local highway, an interstate highway, an elevated rail line that carries commuters between Manhattan and nearby cities in New York and Connecticut, and the neighborhood is largely industrial. Like many of the activists described in the book, La Finca's leaders aim to increase food access, advance environmental justice, and contribute to community empowerment through their agriculture and other on-farm activities. They also focus on many of the positive assets in the South Bronx and their connections with people and cultures throughout the world. The founders chose the name Farm of the South in English, La Finca Del Sur, to reflect both the Latina heritage of many of its members, as well as their collective roots in regions of the southern U.S. and of the global South. So they have harvest festivals, educational tours, and other seasonal events, emphasizing the rich ethnic and cultural connections among residents in the wider South Bronx community, the majority of whom are Latino or African American and Black. The relationships among food, agriculture, people, and place, and their connection to social justice are at the heart of La Finca's programs. alongside its focus on community, La Finca Del Sur, the nonprofit organization that bears the farm's name, is intently focused on fostering women's empowerment, particularly among Black and Latina women. The activities they have include women's open mic nights, women's herbal healing workshops, an after-school program for middle school girls run in collaboration with a local low-income housing development company that provide opportunities for participants to perform, teach, and learn in a venue that's supportive and safe. The organization has fostered women-run enterprises. It commissioned the construction of a small greenhouse on the farm in partnership with the organization Non-Traditional Employment for Women. The farm also extends its focus on women of color to encompass women farmers worldwide. The co-founder, farmer director, and creative educator Nancy Ortiz-Cerrón notes that, quote, women do much of the world's farming, but only get a tiny fraction of the recognition and a tiny fraction of the direct economic return. So La Finca was created in part to shift understandings about the roles of women as farmers, both within and beyond the South Bronx, and to carry out the founders' ideals about socially just systems in which women lead and are recognized for their leadership. So one of the points that we make in this chapter is that many activist groups like La Finca del Sur attempt to align their organizational structures with the ideals of founders and members, grounding their governance practices in specific conceptual frameworks and theories of change. So La Finca's leaders describe themselves as an urban farmer cooperative. The 5-member advisory board is composed primarily of women who self-identify as Latino, African American, or Black, and the board's bylaws make it a de facto non-hierarchical leadership body with members taking on roles that fit their individual strengths and that evolve to meet the organization's changing needs. The board members, along with a core group of member farmers who help guide the farm's trajectory, make their decisions collaboratively. So by positioning themselves as leaders of a cooperatively managed nonprofit organization, the women of La Finca challenge white dominant, patriarchal social structures and top-down organizational design. So in addition to using the farm and gardens activities to challenge oppression within existing social structures, activists like the founders of La Finca put in place an organizational structure that's a model for the social system that they want to see.
So what does this all mean when I hope that most of us are interested here in this room are interested in supporting racial, economic, and gender equity in the city? So in continuing to push back on the themes of common narratives within urban agriculture, our last few chapters take to task rather conventional notions of both the challenges of urban agriculture and of scholarship and indeed knowledge and expertise. So in terms of when we think about challenges to urban agriculture, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of our talk today, it's common to recognize that it's difficult to access land or funding. But we argue, as we learned from the people that we interviewed for the book, that the challenges to groups that are trying to advance social justice through urban agriculture begin at access to land, perhaps, and they often do, or access to funding, but they extend out into the very systems that the organizations are trying to address. They extend out into structural racism and how they affect the organizations and the people working within their own communities to address issues of inequity. They extend to long-term political disenfranchisement in some neighborhoods throughout the city. And so in pushing back on the conventional notions of urban agriculture challenges, we argue that if we really want to support, if policymakers, if funders, if researchers, if people from their various professional and personal positions want to support urban agriculture as a social justice activity, that we really need to be focusing on the structural levels of injustice and not only the more obvious benefits of urban agriculture, like neighborhood beautification and food access. Those continue to be important parts of urban agriculture for all of the groups in this book. We also held in 2014 a community forum to have a conversation among ourselves, a number of academics working in universities throughout the city, and including Nick, who's pictured there, indeed, and a number of the community farmers and gardening activists that we interviewed in the project to have a conversation about the ways that we might deepen collaborations between academic institutions and community-based urban agriculture activists. And we learned some things. We've learned some important things about the types of projects, the types of student projects that could be helpful. But the conversation also evolved quite naturally into taking to task what a scholar is, and eventually leading into a very interesting conversation and a meaningful one about recognition of expertise, who we recognize as an expert, who we recognize as a scholar. We have a chapter on this in our book, which is a self-reflexive chapter, if you will, where we've spent 6 chapters at this point, I guess, talking about and exploring urban agriculture and the work of community-based activists. Here we're also kind of exploring our own work, if you will, and ways that we could see moving forward as individuals or recommendations for others working in academic settings to use social science research to support such projects and to reframe the way that we think about research and expertise in the first place as a social justice act and as a scholar activist act. And so we offer recommendations in this chapter about ways to approach research that might lead toward those ends. I forgot the other slide. Yes. So here is where I want to read a final passage from the book, which is from the last chapter. The last chapter begins with 3 vignettes from different places that are not New York City. We have a vignette from Detroit, a vignette from the El Paso, Santa Fe region, and we have a vignette from Goldsboro, North Carolina. 3 very different stories, but with a focus on ways that organizations in other places outside of New York City are doing very similar things, but contextualized within the places where they live and work. And that many the cases that we chose to highlight in the final chapter are also specifically focused on youth and youth empowerment, which is something that we heard as a recurring theme when talking with activists and leaders here in New York City, and something that is a major theme within urban agriculture and indeed food justice activism and scholarship in the United States right now. So we close with a few thoughts on this. Was this it? Yeah, I didn't have it marked. Because that's not the right chapter. So our last section is called Conclusion as Beginning. To some, urban gardening and farming is merely a way to grow vegetables. To others, the mere act of growing food is a means to transform the food system and change society. We've shown throughout the book that both perspectives are misguided. Urban agriculture can be a powerful force to dismantle multiple forms of oppression and advance social justice, but only if we make it so. Karen Washington, who is also another urban agriculture leader in New York City and is highlighted in the book, goes so far as to suggest that urban agriculture is the new civil rights movement, the civil rights movement that involves growing food. Without naively suggesting that members of a given system of activists, farmers, gardeners, academics, policymakers, and funders can simply begin to work together in solidarity if they desire to do so. We suggest that a key part of advancing social justice is recognizing that all of these actors can be, and in fact need to be, involved. Moving beyond the Kale is about re-envisioning urban agriculture, an activity that many view as a curiosity or a benign anachronism, as a social justice project that can produce tremendous social benefits if we commit the required multi-layered and collaborative activist work that we need. Recognizing the potential for urban agriculture to be used to advance social justice, and recognizing such efforts as existing realities, such as the cases that we highlight in the book, people already doing this work, can help us see openings of freedom and possibility in the farms and gardens that are situated in what some people see as unlikely places. This vision we share for an urban agriculture social justice praxis is one in which anybody can engage.
Thank you. And now we would like to open it up for questions. First, I want to recognize Ray Figueroa, who came in from Friends of Brook Park Farm. And I'd like to take 3 or 4 questions at a time so that we can answer as many as possible. But if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll call you. Okay, you first. And
We're
then.
going to bring you guys mics.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
You'll point out.
Okay. And the woman behind Lauren afterwards. Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you. That was great. My question is, did you guys explore at all how this relates to, I think, one of our considerable inequalities in the food distribution system and kind of the entrenchment of corporate conglomerates who provide the cheapest food and what is also generally the most unhealthy, and how the future production of food can maybe kind of disrupt or alleviate the dominance that companies like McDonald's or other fast food just corporations have, and how that can trickle down to some less fortunate demographics and such.
Great, thanks. We'll come back to that. Yes.
So there's clearly an ability to turn urban agriculture into an economic success, as evidenced by places like Bright Farms, which are hydroponics and growing. And they're typically in urban spaces like New York. Can you comment on the ability of, did you get much beyond soil-based into water-based gardening or vertical or anything like that in the book? And also, can you comment on the potential for economic success beyond the community aspects? So, because the racial inequalities have such a huge impact on the economic success of these farms.
And a third question in the back of the room?
Hi, you talked a lot about how oftentimes we don't see activists in this sense as experts, or how we mostly focus on scholars as these experts. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about steps to take to broaden that, in the sense that have a better understanding of how people who don't use that right terminology, or who don't care about terms per se, or who don't have a degree of this in this field or something, can be better seen as experts.
Great. Well, we'll start with these three questions. Excellent question. And we'll take turns maybe. In relation to the food distribution system, all of the activists that we interviewed were keenly aware that they were connected to a food supply chain that also reinforced race and class disparities. And so the activity of the Jacksons, for example, or of Ray Figueroa's activism, are about changing those larger systems, which include changing the way decisions are made in the city, changing the economic structure in neighborhoods to allow for economic empowerment at the grassroots. And so while the projects themselves may be focusing on the production side of the food system, the activities are beyond the Kale. They're actually working to change the not just the entire food system, but social structures that reinforce race and class disparities. As for the question of high-tech versus low-tech farming, or vertical versus ground level, emerging and have been over the course of the period that we were doing the research. One of the findings that we had was that those higher tech projects tend to attract funding and attract government support in a way that actually disadvantages many of the projects at the neighborhood level that are working using more conventional methods of food production. And there's a tension between efforts to support production agriculture, which in many cases simply reinforce the same kind of disparities in the food system by relying on a large number of poorly compensated workers in a system that attempts to replicate the conventional agriculture system, but in the city and on rooftops. And so our focus was on the projects that are using conventional methods to use their spaces and activities to really deal with these bigger issues, and really try to change the system so that support really is distributed to projects that are changing social structures more than simply creating a small number of low-paid jobs for companies like Bright Farms or Gotham Greens.
Well, and I think to speak to both of the first two questions, a couple things. One is that when we're thinking about urban agriculture, there's some level of thought among some people that urban agriculture is going to somehow replace rural agriculture or compete with it. And I always push back on that idea. That's not really the argument that we're making, and I don't think most community farmers and gardeners that I talk to are making. Rather, addressing food inequities within communities in which people are working and living, but also working with a more regional food system and working to build a more regional food system. And so a number of the farms and gardens in this book, including both groups are represented here today, run farmers markets and work with farmers markets that bring in farm products from regional farmers throughout surrounding New York City. And so we're working to not replace rural or peri-urban agriculture with urban agriculture, but rather working to integrate or create a more regional food system that can support both urban food needs and the needs of farmers both within and outside of the city. And a second thing that I wanted to say with respect to the economic aspects of urban agriculture, one of the key things that we are trying to accomplish with this book is to highlight what groups are trying to accomplish, and to point out that farms and gardens have different forms, but they also have specific objectives. And so when we're, of course, in a phase right now where there's a lot of interest in vertical farming, rooftop farming. I myself work with some rooftop farmers, so there's something against this. But if you're paying attention to urban agriculture right now, this is something that's getting a lot of attention and it's starting to get a lot of support. So if anything, where I come from with respect to that question is that these things can be good. They can be drivers of creating a few jobs, and in fact are in some instances. So how do we then make that better? How do we take the interest in rooftop farming and make it also address some social justice questions more explicitly? Likewise with any kind of vertical farming. And I will point out that as you were asking the questions about aquaponics and hydroponics, that I know that the Jacksons had an aquaponics system. I don't know if you still have it. And a number of the farmers and gardeners highlighted in the book do use hydroponics. Aquaponics is a system of growing fish and plants together in the same system, so it's a closed loop where the fish are feeding off the plants and vice versa. And hydroponic farming is growing plants in a solution without soil. So this can be used in smaller and indoor spaces. So this can take place in high tech and large scales, or it can take place in very low tech and low cost situations. So I guess my main point here is that we can separate the form from the function and form from the objective. And if we want to envision social and economic equity, then we need to put our efforts towards those types of projects, or improving those that already exist.
The activists that we interviewed in the book are experts, and so to the third question, recognizing the expertise that exists within communities is really, really critical, and is a project of the farmers and gardeners, and also our project and projects of colleagues to try to break down the barriers between expertise based on positionality in systems and title. And so I think that the challenge is to continue to work together collegially and in furtherance of the goals of social justice with colleagues who understand firsthand the problems associated with race and class disparities, and have a firsthand knowledge of ways to grapple with those issues.
Something we thought a lot about in writing the book and formulating the research, how, and I'll take a step back here and say how, from my perspective as a white person working in an academic institution, how am I going to do this work with integrity? And so throughout the project, we tried very hard to make sure that when we were conducting research, we were recognizing expertise and knowledge within the communities in which we were conducting research. I didn't mention that we held a small group discussion about halfway through our project where we kind of talked about some of the preliminary findings. And thanks to some suggestions that happened in that meeting, one of the ideas was to stay in touch, to let folks know where we are with this book, which takes a long time to write a book and get it published, right? So it can kind of seem like we took some information and walked away with it, and then what happened? 3 years later, this book comes out. Whoever knew, right? And so we tried very hard throughout this project to do the work with integrity, to follow up on the advice of the folks that we were talking with for the research, to send out the vignettes that we included in the book so that folks could look at it and make sure that it accurately represented what their perspective was. And in a word, I guess, we decided to begin each chapter with a vignette, so these vignettes that we were reading earlier, as a way in writing, as two people writing a book, to bring community voice into the project rather than say, we learned these things and this is what is the truth. Of course, our analysis is what formed the book, but we tried as much as we could to incorporate community voice within the book itself.
And the genesis of the book, as Kristen mentioned at the beginning, was that people were telling us in the Five-Hour Farm Project that there are race and class disparities in the agricultural system, and that we needed to really grapple with those disparities. And so the book itself was an outcome of trying to work collaboratively with and respect the concerns and appreciate the knowledge of the people that we were working with on the first project. Any additional questions, comments? Yes, thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate the work that y'all do continually. I wanted to tease out the difference between community gardening and urban agriculture. I went to a conference, the Vertigo conference a couple years ago, where the history of community gardening was being presented, and actually the presenter kind of downplayed the early work of folks like Hatty Caron and Miss Christine and Green Gorillas in reclaiming space and organizing community around these spaces, and talked about how Cornell came in a little bit later and really tried to increase production in these spaces, and that's real urban agriculture. And or that was real community gardening actually in that workshop, and I disagree with that. And I want to disagree that what you're talking about is urban agriculture. It sounds a lot more like community gardening than urban agriculture. The Bright Farms and the Gotham trees, that's urban agriculture to me. And what you're talking about is actually cultivating community around these green spaces and having activists working, not necessarily towards profit or calling themselves farmers because that's what they do for a living, but they're activists within the community gardening and cultivating that community together. Do you see this important distinction with that? And if so, do you think it's important to claim urban agriculture as a term that we use as part of what we do, as part of our parsony and lexicon, or should we stick to our guns and be community gardeners?
Christian. A question here, and then
Thank you. I was in a talk last week which it was focused on San Diego as kind of a case study of community gardens and farmers markets there, so it's slightly different from your focus. But they were kind of looking at the intersections between the development of community gardens and probably particularly farmers markets in various neighborhoods and kind of the ways in which they kind of, I guess, got co-opted into gentrification processes. And so how a lot of the people they interviewed had kind of social justice motivations behind them, but they actually kind of worked in more kind of complex and in some cases sort of troubling ways. And so I guess you've emphasised the importance of context and location, and I wondered if you kind of encountered any of those concerns in your research.
So picking up on that last question, I wonder if you could each talk a little about what are some of the intersections and tensions between urban agriculture, community gardening, gentrification, and housing affordability, all things that are playing out in New York City right now.
These are great points. We'll try to address all three, but the issue of urban agriculture as a force for gentrification is really a critical one, recognized by all of the activists that we interviewed in our book. We talk about the history of urban agriculture in New York City and the notion of reclaiming spaces that were vacant and created as vacant spaces through disinvestment, both in the public and private sector, and urban agriculture as a force for gentrifying communities like the Lower East Side, which has more than 40 community gardens that were developed in the 1970s when the neighborhood was subject to significant disinvestment. And so the activists in our book are trying to sort of battle with that contradiction of improving their neighborhoods and sort of developing the political power to grapple with issues of zoning and land use and larger public policies that will eventually affect their communities. So the example of Friends of Burke Park hosting a meeting of an organization that works with to fight against homelessness and fights for the development of really affordable housing is one example, but there are many examples of the garden and farm groups trying to struggle to make sure that their farms don't simply add real estate value to their community and therefore result in gentrification.
Well, and, I really agree with that analysis, and to me, I also think about the same coming back to what's the structural problem and how do we work through urban agriculture and other mechanisms to solve the structural problem. And so, developing ways that community members can have more political clout to work within community districts to fight, to counter or stave off gentrification, stave off transition, I think is a key part of this work. I was going to say besides that. And the fact that as some of the groups are doing, like Friends of Burke Park, working with other groups to again make this argument in a public policy setting that the question isn't gardens or housing, or shouldn't be just gardens or housing, but we actually have to broaden the lens and think about social and economic equity in the ways that food and shelter are both important parts of equity in the city, rather than the divide and conquer mentality I think that can happen. So I think the work that's already been being done is starting to address that, and I think that a goal can be to build more political clout in the long run, so that gentrification can be addressed before it really becomes rampant.
And projects like Brooklyn Rescue Mission, for example, are really focused on raising the issue of economic disempowerment that happens in communities as external investments come in but bypass the existing residents. And so those projects can be opportunities to educate and hopefully empower residents of neighborhoods that are facing gentrification to really try to transform the economic system and work for policies that will create better jobs and actually entrepreneurial and other economic opportunities for existing residents. The initial question about urban agriculture versus community gardens is an interesting one. There's no hard and fast distinction between a community garden and urban farms. Scale is one distinction, but your point is that the community aspect of community gardening is really critical. And all of the projects that are in our book whether they are larger scale and producing larger amounts of food, or smaller community focused projects like La Finca Del Sur are really aiming to deal with issues that are facing the local community.
Well, and I think, do you want to respond to that too?
Yeah, I heard the 3 questions, and they were very interesting. If you could give me a few seconds.
Yeah.
The gentrification question, how do gardens farms manage in environments where neighborhoods being gentrified? So Bed-Stuy is being gentrified. A $300,000 home is now $1.25 million. The new residents that are coming in buying the home at $1.25 million are very interested in the urban farm that we have. In fact, they asked, is the farm going to be there? Because I will purchase the home if the farm is going to be there. They're very receptive to our farm, but they have ownership of the farm immediately, based on the fact that the people that are working the farm, meaning myself and the volunteers and the teenagers, the younger people, are looked upon as caretakers and not owners. So you already have a mentality of, I come to own, and you are a caretaker, and we eventually will own. So the reality of how you mix these conversations and interact people who have different thoughts of ownership, and how much I interact with you based on race, ethnicity, and gender. Now, we have a garden that we have just working with Green Thumb and the city on, and we had to have that garden be developed. So we have gentrifiers. We have old neighborhood folks who are been in the neighborhood. We have ethnic people who are immigrants. And it's going to be a major task of having those cultural and different ethnic as well as economic people work together. But we've done it before. We've seen a year and a half or 2 years of people making meetings, and it's going to be in the National Garden. But we understand there's going to be pushback based on their attitude, their behaviors, and what they understand about each other. That's just normal. Now, I heard the young man talk about urban farming versus gardening. Well, the folks that do gardening are very proud of it. But the definition of farming is, with the USDA, $1,000 a week. It's just that simple. Now, I heard the young lady talk about gentrification farmers markets. We just left our farmers market. It's supported by Economic Engine, which is like a $30 million engine, even though we're a very small nonprofit. And that farmers market was based on the fact that our customers that would go there would be African American and Caribbean. Absolutely wrong. The main customers at that farmers market are Bangladesh. So you can assume if you create a product that it's going to reach a certain amount of people, but it can adjust itself. And we have multiple race and ethnicity shopping, even though the main farmer, the flagship farmer, is one of the few black farmers in the state. So you can plan some things out. You can work around race. You can work around economic viability of how well people are established. But you always have to be conscious of the fact that they think differently. And you have to be somewhere in the middle working the difference. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to say about the community garden, urban agriculture discussion. When we created Bed-Stuy Farm, we did sit down and talk to the Cornell Cooperative Extension. It was designed strictly for production. We didn't think about ledges, we didn't think about shades, we didn't think about anything. They said, we're going to farm straight from the back to the fence. Okay, we're going to put in rows, it was very carefully planned. We thought about how we could produce safe food, clean food, protected food. You know, what do you do about the cats? What do you do about all these other issues? How do you handle compost? And each one of these major challenges, for us a major challenge is water. But each one of these major challenges, we had to sit down and plan out. Whereas when I look at it, I think about community gardens, the main difference is, I think there's a more social aspect that that is implied within a garden. So within our farm, you're never going to see us like standing out there doing anything. Either we're working or we're not there. So it's no social, it's work to us. It's just straight work. You may wave at the neighbors and let them come in, or let the little children visit the chickens. But whereas when I visit a community garden, I want a place to sit. I want to look at flowers. We plant flowers strictly for the neighbors. That's it, not for us. And then we started to find some nicer ones, amongst the ones that we could sell. It was strictly, that's how we looked at how we planned it out for now.
And I think just to follow on what you each said, this question about what's viewed as agriculture, legitimate agriculture versus gardening is not legitimate agriculture. I mean, it's been a long-standing debate within trying to get support for urban agriculture. And I think that depending on what one is trying to accomplish, it either matters a lot or it doesn't, right? And if you're interested in support from USDA, it really does make a difference if you are a commercial farm that grosses $1,000 a year. Perhaps that will shift. The USDA is starting to pay a lot more attention to urban agriculture, but certain forms, particularly rooftop farms. But that could shift as well. So I think that if that's the goal, the definition means a lot. If the goal is to be making change in the community through food production, then it's a farm or it's a garden. Perhaps the language that we use doesn't mean quite as much as it does in the context of trying to work with a government policy or agency.
Hi. What kind of resources do you think that the organizations that you spoke with need to make to really strengthen the existing advocacy and policy work that they're doing to make the kind of big systemic changes that you're talking about?
Yeah, let's take, are there any other questions? Jen?
Just really continuing on the same theme of policy change. What policy changes at the local level and maybe at state and federal level would you want to see to nourish urban agriculture and community gardening?
And one more question? We can take one more.
I guess I would ask the question, when it comes to policy, are the people in the community asking for it, or are we parachuting in and recommending it? I don't live in New York right now, so I've come up from another state, and I'm just interested as to what the approach is, whether it's organic or it's coming from outside.
One more question, and then we'll try to answer them all.
Urban farmers are overworked and or underpaid, or not paid at all, doing it free time, voluntary, and for many it's a labor of love. But there's always the constant struggles to find funding, time, and fighting all sorts of other battles. In your research, did you find models that had sort of achieved were sustainable in that regard?
Okay, let's try to take these quick. In terms of resources needed for policy change, there are resources developed by activist farmers themselves in coalition building, for example. But there are opportunities in the public sector to give greater power to local communities through participatory budgeting, for example, through greater participation in zoning and planning initiatives. And so one of the goals of the farms that are featured in the book is to really raise these issues of the need to have greater say in development patterns and public policies, including how resources for urban agriculture are allocated by the city. Policy changes that could support urban agriculture include a commitment, a permanent commitment to the existing urban agriculture system by permanent land tenure for existing community gardens and greater resources for gardens and farms directed at, we would argue, the community-based projects that are really aiming to change the social and economic dynamics in communities. And that hasn't happened. There's been an increase in the budget for Green Thumb, but it's still much lower per farm than in other major American cities. And there's still not an emphasis on the community-based farms. And as I mentioned before, a lot of attraction to the higher tech farms that city officials think might bring in higher paying jobs or new businesses producing the technology that those farms are using. Organic versus outside?
Yeah, and I'll add to that too. I think Evan's often encouraged me to think about, and others, an overall urban agriculture plan within the city. Currently, the situation is that multiple agencies have purview of our urban agriculture, whether it's gardening or farming, however you want to define that. But we don't have a citywide policy plan that says urban agriculture is an important part of the city, and this is how different agencies should work to support the maintenance over the long term of urban agriculture throughout the 5 boroughs. And kind of a second thought that I have about that is that if we're, as we are when we're talking about this book today, thinking about urban agriculture and social justice or social equity, and bringing an equity analysis to developing policies or plans or agency programs to support urban agriculture could go a long way as well. So that the argument isn't these particular farms should be the subject of a new policy, but rather what do we want to achieve from an equity standpoint, and what kind of policy measures do we need to put in place to support farms and gardens that achieve those equity goals. I'm thinking a lot about this beyond the Kale, beyond the book, in terms of the recent interest in rooftop farming. So how can we make this practice address equity outcomes and other new forms and longer term existing and established forms of urban agriculture in the city? It's the approach, I think, that can also help.
And there are tangible things. I mean, cities like Seattle have anti-racism training programs for city officials to help city officials understand structural racism and how to change policies to ensure that they're fair and not race or class biased.
And there's quite a lot of that type of work going on right now. If you happen to be in Atlanta, Georgia next month, I think there's a 2-day training on racial equity for governance and policymaking. The other question that we were going to talk about, second question, the policy change from within or without. I always pause when I say we to question who I mean when I'm saying we. And so, from a standpoint of the work that I've been doing, I don't live in any of the communities that are highlighted in the book, but we were focused on the ways that the activists and the leaders in the communities that we did highlight are actually working on policy change. Policy change happens at all levels of society, as we've kind of discussed this afternoon. And I think the important part is to recognize that fact, and that if you're coming from outside of the community and thinking about policy change, what are the folks in the community already doing, first of all, and then what do the folks in the community think is needed? How can one from the outside help? That's the approach that I have in this work.
Thanks.
I think we have.
Policy change. A lot of our group is a very small group, but I have a friend over there at City Harvest. So about 2000 to get a farmer's so that you would say to the city, here's $20,000. Because the city treated farmers markets as if they were commercial businesses like the Frank Guy and everybody else in the park. So most people couldn't afford a small group like ours, couldn't afford to put $20,000 that the city is. So with City Harvest and the state ag, the city of New York was lobbying of the Brooklyn Rescue Mission, and it took a year and a half, about a year. It was a small group. Now, you just talked about urban ag and the potential of funding. Ray, where you at? Okay. Ray and I and a bunch of other activists were in a room. I can't say the meeting was secret, okay, but it was in a room, okay, with Senator Hildebrand's chief of staff. You can talk about metrics, you can talk about growing in different styles, we're going to talk about ground, hydroponics, aquaponics. None of that got the chief of staff's attention. How did the urban gardens and farms affect community? And how does it change community? And how does it benefit community? And economically, how was the disparities with urban farmers and gardeners around the country that the senator might help fix? That's what got her chief of staff's attention. So Ray and I and a bunch of other folks focused our attention on that policy change. The senator went into state ag, went into USDA ag, did her job, and just last week or this week, they had a conference in Washington on how to fund urban farming. So don't think that small groups, Black folks, Latino folks, Hmong's, Vietnamese, and poor white folk can have effect in community if given the right partnership. What happens is if the partner is strongholding or pushing their agenda, then the small group gets pushed aside, and a lot of times the real agenda gets pushed aside. But if you have good partners, you can make successful policy change. Thank you.
Thanks.
Should we let the Reverend have the last word?
To a more, maybe about 10 more minutes in the room.
Yes.
Maybe you could answer questions from small groups of people for the last 10 minutes.
Yeah, that would be great. Any other questions or thoughts?
Hi. So not really a question, but just color commentary to what the Reverend said. So the U.S. Farm Bill has, I guess you call it an addendum based on urban agriculture. So as you said, policy change, there's millions and millions and millions of dollars of funding that the U.S. Senate is looking at to fund urban agriculture and community growing. Because they see it as, I mean, obviously the connection to Connecticut community benefit, but also, as you spoke about, the connection as a benefit for local agriculture on the state level. I mean, just about every farmer in the book that you mentioned has some type of other enterprise associated with their community garden, whether it's a farmer's market or whether it's hot sauce or whatever, or employing kids during the summer. Just between these two, they're employing young women and young men with summer jobs that a lot of times the city can't provide. So the federal government sees it as potential, even though on the city level, there's pushback against urban growing and people trying to take back public land, but we won't get into that conversation.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah. We have the mic up here.
First of all, thank you very much. I just really, before I say too much, I just want to thank Nevin and Kristen for doing very, very seminal work in terms of getting this type of quote-unquote research out to begin to broach the subject of social justice, the subject of structural racism, as it ramifies from, through, and out of our notions and conceptions of the food system. I want to thank you personally for really doing a tremendous job for getting that conversation out there. It seems like most conversations have been just, beating around the bush with that subject and not really addressing what I would call the elephant in the room, which is structural in nature, mass unemployment, mass poverty, leads to hunger, leads to food insecurity, leads to all kinds of toxic outcomes in the community. But I'm not going to get on a soapbox with that. What I wanted to do, because I easily could, just building on the point of brother over here mentioned hot sauce. Well, we're part of a collective of pepper growers in the Bronx, right? A pepper growing collective. And when I say we, that is to say about 3 dozen, correct me if I'm wrong, 3 dozen of us community farms, community gardens have come together. Why do I mention that? Because community gardens have been really pejoratively looked down upon as being economically inconsequential. What can a community garden do? Well, because I'm a great believer that innovation does come from the margins and from those that are marginalized. You know, we did come together based on our community organizing and said, you know, we can do this. So let's come together. We've come together for other things. So let's come together around an opportunity whereby we can be the pepper growers, realize economy of scale, and be the pepper growers for something known as Bronx hot sauce. If you don't know about Bronx hot sauce, shame on you. You know, you should be supporting Bronx hot sauce. What do we do out of Friends at Brook Park? Just to make some of the social justice connections at the Brook Park Youth Farm, we have an alternatives to incarceration program. What does that mean? We work from youth that have been incarcerated. My worst case is, well, I had 2, but one just recently came out of solitary confinement at Rikers. If you don't know anything about Rikers, it's the hellhole that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. All right. So we have young people that are street organization affiliated, young people that have caught all kinds of other types of unsavory charges, attempted murder, and on and on and on. Guess what? Being involved in something such as the youth farm, being involved in the pepper growing collective initiative, really has to speak beyond the technical aspects of urban agriculture, has really done much to, if you will, cultivate a sense of agency, personal agency, a sense of collective efficacy, a sense of human dignity as a result of being a productive individual who is so much so is being remunerated, although productivity is not does not purely need to be measured in remuneration terms. But let's just say that sense of productivity really does a tremendous amount for a person's sense of self-worth, self-esteem, human dignity. And can't begin to tell you what this does for current and former so-called gangbangers. I mean, this really pulls this stuff out, and it really speaks to, and mind you, folks, I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to say that we are proving that, urban agriculture does work. We are part of the good Reverend back here mentioned, the gathering of us. We're known as Peace and Justice, and yes, and it's practitioners of color. We are practitioners. We are policy wonks, and we all come together. And that's why we have been as effective as we have. And we are pushing very, very hard on the state, on the federal government, and at the local level.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you very much, Ray, for those comments. Great way to end the session. And thank you so much, Kristen, for your wonderful book and your presentation, and to all of you for your questions and comments and intense engagement with this issue.
Thank you.
I apologize, but we have a class in here in about 15 minutes, and we need to relatively expeditiously